My name is Glen Alleman, and I live north of Denver in the United States, in Colorado. My primary area of work is in aerospace and defense and enterprise software-intensive systems of systems. And in those domains, projects are complex and they require a unique set of tasks and activities, almost always within some time constraints, certainly a budget constraint, and with mandatory capabilities at the end of the project. Risks in our project are complex, and they arise from a wide range of sources and having a broad scope of possible effects on the project. Given these two dimensions of project complexity, the management of the relationship between the project work and the project risk is our critical success factor for every project we work. This workshop is about the principles of risk management and how those principles must be in place for success. And our second workshop speaks to the practices that implement these principles. We've got a short time here and it will pass quickly, so we're going to review these topics at the highest level, but we'll cover the principles that must guide our practices. For without principles, any practice has no reason for being there. Risk management concerns the impact of uncertainty on objectives. And these objectives are the prime consideration in the management of any project or any related activity. Objectives are the consideration usually defined in ISO 31000 that speak to the principles and guidelines of effective risk management and define risk as the effect of uncertainty on the possibility of achieving an organization's objectives and tell us what defining those objectives must be in place before attempting to handle risk. This emphasizes the role of uncertainty. Risk are future events with a probability of occurrence and a potential for loss. Many problems that arise in software development or any high technology development were first known as risks by someone on the project staff. Addressed in time, risks can be avoided, negated, or have their impacts reduced. The problem or issue that arises comes from a risk when it becomes true. Risk can be described in terms of probability, that is the probability of the risk, the consequence, the loss, and the time frame. Probability is the likelihood that the consequence will occur, and consequence is the effect of some unsatisfactory outcome, and the time frame refers to when the risk will occur during the product or project or services life cycle. Uncertainty is inherent when the process attempts to answer the question, what should we decide is an acceptable risk? What risk should be taken into consideration? Who does or will the risk affect? What conditions must be present for the decision on the acceptability or unacceptability of the risk to be made? And why would this risk become acceptable? There are many definitions of risk from many different sources, many authors, many guides, many risk associations. This definition fits well with the principles of risk management. Excuse me. It starts with the beginning of a systematic risk understanding, and that risk is a disciplined management process performed in accordance with a set of process guidelines and specific data needed to assess the risk and assess the effectiveness of the handling strategies. This definition also establishes that all risk comes from uncertainty, and in our project world, risk comes in two forms: allatory uncertainty, which is irreducible, and epistemic uncertainty, which can be reduced. With the identified uncertainties, determining the impact of the probability of project success is the next risk management process. Risk handling strategy is then applied to reduce these uncertainties. The term management of risk is actually a misnomer. Since uncertainty cannot be managed, we can only manage in the presence of uncertainty and the risk it creates with risk buy-down activities or margin for our irreducible uncertainties. With this definition, it looks like the principles of managing projects in the presence of uncertainty can now be started. So here's a straightforward chart talking about the systems engineering view of risk management, and we'll get into details on the next chart. These elements of risk management include obvious things. We have to identify the risks, We've got to analyze their probability of occurrence and their potential impact. We've got to determine and evaluate the contingencies for these risks. We've got to have some way to trace the risks to the impacts of the project. We've got to proactively manage the risks. That is, we have to proactively handle the outcomes of the risks and prevent them or correct them from happening. And we have to find out what is the potential problem for the risk. What is the root cause of these uncertainties? And we have to proactively manage these risks, which means that we've got to determine a strategy up front and all the contingencies that will prevent the risk from becoming a problem or limit its impact when it does. Risk identification concentrates on the identification of hazards and threats and vulnerabilities that could negatively impact the work efforts or plans or the outcomes. Risk identification seeks out probable or realistic risks in achieving our objectives. And it is not effective to attempt to address every risk, every possible event from that risk, and every impact up front. We have to do that in an iterative and incremental manner. Analysis and review of the risk of the interface requirements start with the specifications. And we can identify the risks associated with cost and schedule and technical performance across the product lifecycle phases. And we can identify other risks, such as risks associated with labor availability, technology cycle time, and all the competition from other sources to our project success. And we've got to look at the risk lessons learned, possibly having even a lessons learned database. And we review all these elements through the work breakdown structure to assure that all aspects of the work effort have been considered. And we review all these elements of the project plan to ensure that all the aspects of the project have been considered and all the work has been planned to deliver the outcomes and what is the risk to those outcomes. And of course, we can use historical databases to look at the relative time frame when the risk will occur, the conditions surrounding those risks that have caused this concern, and any of the doubts or uncertainties from the past that will impact our projects today. Before we go on, let's look at the framework for managing in the presence of uncertainty related to the engineering solutions to our problems. Alan Kay is an American computer scientist who literally invented much of what we see today and what we're using today at Xerox PARC in Palo Alto, California, at the Palo Alto Research Center. He invented object-oriented programming. He invented graphical user interfaces. He literally invented a desktop computer called the Dynabook, and a programming language, Smalltalk, which is not in that much use today. And the concept of Windows as we know it in Apple and in Microsoft were done at Xerox PARC by Alan Kay. They both stole those ideas. The key here is that he suggests that principles are the foundation of all we do, and if we're not guided by principles and we extract new principles, then we cannot discover whether those practices are going to be effective or not. And if we're not engineering the solutions, we're just playing around. And that case, with the processes and the tools and the domains, we're going to encounter problems with those, and we're going to end up with a solution looking for a problem to solve. There's lots of other advice about managing risk, and Yogi Berra will tell us something that in a little bit here. And these flaws about managing risk are fundamental. And they start with the failure to understand that all risk comes from uncertainty, and uncertainty on projects only comes in two types that have been mentioned before. And the value of the severity and the likelihood in a simple risk matrix is actually random numbers that we're trying to do arithmetic with. And the mathematics of performing arithmetic on these numbers to get the risk score by multiplying the probability of occurrence times the probability of impact is a category error in mathematics. And these uncertainties defined in these 5x5 charts are not defined by the uncertainties encountered on projects, the allatory and epistemic uncertainties. And we'll see examples of 5x5 charts properly applied in practices, but for now, the approach to risk itself is created by the 5x5 charts. So many decades ago, Yogi Berra understood the basis of project success. In this 1974 paper, The paper is available at the NASA document site, by the way, and at the end of this workshop there'll be a link to all the documents that I reference. It took time to understand that maintenance is part of risk management, and the determinants of risk success start with risk management. So we're back to another quote that we'll use many times here, and that's Tim Lister's core principle, that risk management is project management for adults. So continuous risk management is the basis of success for all projects, and this means that the management of risk is not an event, it's a process, and that is continually applied to every aspect of the project. Here are some functions performed by continuous risk management. We must prevent or correct the underlying root causes before they create the risk. This is easily done with a pre-mortem to assess what could happen and how that could be prevented in the future. Continuous product quality is the basis of removing the conditions and actions that create the root causes that then create risk. This is classic Lean or Six Sigma approach to managing projects. Resource shortfalls or improper resources are one of the primary sources themselves of creating risk on projects. We don't have the right people at the right time with the right skills. And of course, team building is the basis of making any changes and applying continuous risk management, removing all the underlying root causes, taking preventative or corrective actions to handle the risk and prevent them from becoming issues, and using John Katzenbach's definition of a team, which is a group of qualified individuals who hold themselves mutually accountable for a shared outcome, is the basis of continuous risk management. In our complex world of projects and programs, we many times fail to understand that complicated and complex and complexity are not the same thing. Managing in the presence of complexity is not the same as managing in the presence of complications. In each of these domains, risk is created by uncertainty, and we'll see that uncertainties come in two primary forms for projects, as mentioned before, and these uncertainties that are reducible and uncertainties that are irreducible. In this workshop, we'll speak to the principles of managing in the presence of uncertainty that create risk, and in the second workshop, we'll speak to the practices based on these principles for reducing these uncertainties, or at least handling those uncertainties to increase the probability of success. If we're going to have any books on our shelf about risk management, then Edmund Conroe's book is the one to have. I've worked with Ed on several manned spaceflight programs, and he is one of the well-known risk management thought leaders, at least here in the United States. If we look at the last quote in the context of Tim Lister's advice, risk management is project management for adults, then risk management is our number one activity as a project manager. All other management activities on projects revolve around identifying the sources of risk, undertaking the corrective and preventive actions needed to remove or reduce these uncertainties, and all that is needed to increase the probability of project success. So Stephen Covey's second habit of highly effective people is applicable here. Start with the end in mind. No project can be successful until we know what done looks like in units of measure meaningful to the decision makers. And the two starting measures for all projects are measures of effectiveness and measures of performance. This also means that the effectiveness and performance of our risk handling strategies are needed for calculating the probability of program success. For any project, success comes from the applications of principles and practices and processes. And I'm going to try to convince you today in our short time that you have 5 immutable principles are the foundation of all project success. And these principles are immutable because they're always present no matter the domain, no matter the context, no matter the technology. And they're the foundation on which the practices and processes of project risk management and project success management are built. And we'll look at the practices and processes of risk management in the second workshop in detail, but let's look at the principles of risk management here to start. Understanding the 5 key principles of project success will help all managers deliver on time or on budget when tackling projects of any size in any domain. And there's actually a probability of on time and on budget, so nothing is guaranteed. And the successful management of projects requires initiating and planning and executing and managing the resources to effectively complete the specific deliverables, all the standard project management words that we hear. And in this workshop, we'll focus on risk management, number 4. But all 5 principles are needed to increase the probability of project success. So we'll say it again until we're tired of hearing of it, but all risk is created by uncertainty and the handling strategies of the outcomes of that risk when it comes true, the issues. This is the central paradigm in a wide range of fields, from engineering to medicine, life sciences to economics. This concept is critical to any risk management process. The emphasis and the re-emphasis started with a risk management paradigm in the seismic engineering domain for the insurance underwriting to protect buildings from earthquakes. The project management domains have not yet fully understood the principles that all risk comes from uncertainties, but we're getting closer. In this workshop, hopefully we'll spread that word. All risk comes from uncertainty. I'll say it again. Only by identifying first the type of uncertainty and the root causes for that uncertainty. With those 2 pieces of information, we can start a handling strategy to prevent or correct the root causes of the risk that will turn into issues if we don't have a proper handling strategy. Well, each of the 5 immutable principles is critical to the success of the project. Managing the risk is created by these uncertainties is essential. If we have good answers to the other 4 principles and we don't have handling strategies for the risks, our probability of success is greatly reduced. Every element of project management is impacted by uncertainty and the reducible and irreducible risks created by those uncertainties. So risk management is project management. Project management is risk management. There are many sources for definitions of risks. ISO 31000 is the most applicable since it states the impact of the risk and the source of the risk. Inadequate knowledge is the basis of epistemic uncertainty that creates risk. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. Uncertainty of a state can be the basis of allatory uncertainty as well. Allia is a single die that the Greeks used to gamble. It's a natural variance. It is the decision-making processes that are critical for project success and the management of risk. Recording the risk, analyzing the risks are important, but actionable outcomes are needed if those risks are to not rapidly turn into issues. It is this risk-informed decision-making process that is the critical success factor for all project work. Good decisions require good information and enough time to apply that decision. This is the basis of system thinking. The 2 dimensions of risk include the degree of possibility that the risk will occur for epistemic uncertainties, the shape of the probability distribution curve described as a stochastic properties for allatory uncertainties, and each of these is the starting point describing what is the possibility the risk will occur. The consequence of that risk occurring, which itself is a probabilistic process, described by a probability density function or some confidence interval. Again, this is why we cannot do arithmetic between the probability of occurrence and the probability of impact to create some risk score, since the values of the probability of occurrence and the probability of impact are actually integral equations. The practice session that we're going to have next will show us how that works or doesn't work and what the solution is. So again, uncertainty creates risk, and as we've mentioned before, on projects uncertainty comes in 2 forms, epistemic and allatory, and this is repeated over and over during our principles because it is not well used in most of our standard risk management handbooks, including ones from the Project Management Institute. Epistemic uncertainty is something we can do about. We can buy more knowledge, we can test more, we can build redundancy. Allatory uncertainty we cannot do anything about. We can only have margin to protect the project from the risks created by this naturally occurring variance in cost and schedule and technical performance. Research shows that allatory uncertainty is the overwhelming source of risk on most projects, naturally occurring processes. It's these naturally occurring processes and variances for the allatory uncertainty that dominate the creation of the sources that we must handle. These naturally occurring variances are encountered in productivity, random sequences in the supply chain, in the weather, any other uncertainty source driven by naturally occurring random processes. And I want to emphasize here the little picture in the upper right that the difference between probability and statistics. So epistemic uncertainties are probabilistic and allatory uncertainties are statistical. So we must separate those. And the Greeks knew about uncertainty through their goddess of chance. And once we accept the fact that all projects operate in the presence of uncertainty, we now have a new role for the project manager, using Tim Lister's quote again, that risk management is project management for adults. The project management of process for risk management has to be closed loop in short increments to adapt and respond to emerging uncertainties. Ask yourself, how long are you willing to wait before you find out you're late or you're over budget or the thing you're building doesn't work? Then you must have to be able to assess that project to plan at half that distance in order to take corrective actions or preventive actions. Otherwise, you're going to be late and you're going to be over budget and it's not going to work and you're not going to be able to change that. So here's an approach to defining risk management's foundations that was developed in the book titled Beyond Bullet Points. And this is a good use of that book for any project management work. This approach is taken from the Greeks in their theater, because the oracle of the theater in Greek literature and in Greek public plays explained to the audience what was happening, since the majority of the people in the audience were actually illiterate and did not understand the storyline. The same approach is used by William Shakespeare when he plagiarized most of his work from the Greeks. If we remember, it was a dark and stormy night and the young prince was unhappy, and he began his quest to restore his happiness, along with the way few people had to die. Sounds familiar, right? Hamlet. That was the opening part of Hamlet. So try this same approach for any problem that you have that's going to require corrective or preventive actions, and keep your risks from turning into issues. Take this slide, put it in your notebook, and use it for everything that you do when you're doing your plans. So why do risk management? Why not just respond to the issues as they arrive and take actions to create the deficiencies to the outcomes that we've been paid to produce? Well, risk management prevents issues that can't simply be simpler than that. It's risk prevention, risk result prevention, issue prevention that is all about risk management. This starts with removing all the non-recoverable sunk costs for fixing them. It starts with understanding what the risks are. It starts with writing down phrases of what the sources of the risk are and what their corrective or preventive actions can be. Without a programmatic architecture, cost, schedule, and risk management supporting the technical architecture, risks and their corrections and their preventions to deliver the needed technical capabilities simply can't be done, assessed or measured or reduced. So measuring progress to plan in the presence of uncertainty requires probabilistic modeling of the uncertainties of cost, schedule, and technical performance in some kind of unit that's meaningful to the decision maker. This meaningful information of the status of the program during its development is critical input to decision making in the presence of uncertainty, and that's what we're after. We have to manage in the presence of uncertainty. We cannot manage the uncertainty itself. So here's a few more quotes before we start about risk management that we can turn into a poster and put on the wall in our project management works. Tim Gleb, who writes about project management in the Scandinavian countries and around the world, is a well-known thought leader in the development of complex software. We know Colin Powell as a retired general and Secretary of State. And Mr. Kendall's quote is applicable in any domain, and he was in charge of acquisition technology and logistics in the Defense Department, where I work often. But let's remember the real quote from the captain of the Titanic. He could not imagine any condition that would cause his ship to sink, except, of course, there were many conditions right in front of him just as he left the harbor. He did not look outside to see that. So again, uncertainty is embedded in all aspects of project and program management, portfolio management. It's present in our decision-making processes for the integration of scope and complexity and schedule management and cost management and risk management, as this is mentioned in the PMI standards and other management standards. Uncertainty derives from not knowing for sure if a statement is true or false. More specifically, in the absence of information, or if put more scientifically, it is the difference between the amount of information required to perform a task and the amount of information already possessed. That's the risk. Uncertainty is considered crucial to be identified and mitigated, as it contributes to severe consequences to the project or the portfolio or the program. And depending upon the level of the uncertainty and the consequences, it may result in jeopardizing an outcome of an action or even the whole project. It's worth mentioning that uncertainty is not only part of project management, it's also part of the technical implementation of the project. Again, uncertainty comes in two parts, epistemic and allatory. And with those two understandings, we can come up with specific actions to take corrective or preventive actions for the root causes of those uncertainties. This means statistical analysis, measures, quantifying this uncertainty, building models of the potential impact of the decision in the context, and all that kind of stuff that is done in tools that we'll see in our second workshop. But the outcome is to increase our probability of success. Epistemic risk is modeling by defining the probability the risk will occur and the time frame in which it occurs, which this probability is active, and the probability of impact or consequence from the risk when it does occur. Risk statements are used for this, for these epistemic statements. And here's how to form a statement, right? We have to have an explicit or implicit handling plan. We use the word handling for special purposes rather than management, because we can only handle the outcomes. Mitigation is one of those ways of handling. But the risk handling work is actual work, so it has to be in the schedule and it has to have budget assigned to it. And we're going to do this work to mitigate the risk. We're going to buy down the risks, or we're going to retire the risks. And in all cases, we're spending money and we're consuming time, and we're going to do all this work to reduce the probability that the risk will occur. Or we could be spending money and consuming time to reduce the impact of the risk if it does occur, if we can't manage the risk or buy down the risk. In both items, we're taking actions to address the risk. So understanding that uncertainty in cost estimates supports the decision process for setting targets and contingencies and risk treatment plans. And before reducible cost risk can take place, we got to have a cost structure. And the cost risk analysis goes beyond capturing the WBS in the basis of estimate or the cost estimating relationships. And it's the failure to identify or properly manage this technical risk that results in usually in project degradation, security breaches, system failures, increased maintenance, and all the significant other technical debt and additional cost that we see on our projects. So avoiding a technical risk avoids the associated schedule risk, but we have to know those risks in order to avoid them. But there can be epistemic schedule uncertainty that drives reducible risk as well. Cost risk estimating estimates, or cost risk estimating assessment, addresses the cost and schedule and technical risks that impact the cost estimate. To quantify these cost impacts to reducible risk, the sources of the risk must be identified. Allatory uncertainty is uncertainty that comes from random processes. Flipping a coin, determining and predicting heads or tails, is an allatory uncertainty. Rolling the dice for the Greeks, the allia, is an allatory uncertainty. We don't know which number will come up 1 through 6 when we throw the dice. When we observe a random or naturally occurring variance, it's part of a natural process. We're observing the allatory uncertainties in action. An allatory uncertainty refers to the inherent uncertainty due to a probabilistic variability. The weather is allatory uncertainty. All good construction projects have weather delays built into their schedules. This uncertainty is irreducible, unless you're a deity and can cause it to stop raining, and it always has variability in the underlying variables. And these uncertainties are characterized by a statistical distribution function. And the parameter that's being measured, the duration, the speed, the discharge of a river flow, is a stochastic process, and it cannot be reduced. Allatory uncertainty and the resulting risk is modeled with a probability distribution function. This PDF describes the possible values of the process can take and the probability of each value. For a simple coin toss, there's a 50-50 chance it'll be heads or tails. For the die, the allia, there's a 1 chance in 6, it'll be the number that you need to win the money. But if I have multiple tosses of a fair coin, the probability distribution is going to be the total number of heads and the total number of tails. Turns out to be a binomial distribution. For epistemic uncertainty, this is modeled as a probability distribution function, showing the probability of occurrence and confidence intervals. For allatory uncertainties, we have a probability density function that shows us if we know the probability of occurrence, we know the most likely occurrence, and we know the distributions of those occurrences, we can create a random model of the outcomes to some confidence level. So here's some more detailed definitions of epistemic and allatory uncertainty, right? So epistemic is randomness due to the knowable probabilities. We know the probability that this will fail to some confidence level, and it's the scientific uncertainty due to limited data. So we can pay money to get more data. And we can, in principle, be allatory uncertainty or epistemic uncertainties can be eliminated by sufficient study. If we studied enough, if we build enough prototypes, if we do enough testing, we can reduce it to the point where it's acceptable. And allatory variability is the randomness of unknowable probabilities. They arise from the inherent randomness of a variable or are characterized by a probability density function. Epistemic is the distribution function, allatory is the density function. So knowledge of experts or running tests cannot reduce allatory uncertainty. They can profile it and we can discover the attributes of it, but it cannot be reduced. It is irreducible. So uncertainty about the uncertainty. This is an important aspect too. When we separate allatory and epistemic uncertainties and their handling strategies, we have uncertainty about uncertainty. Risks, uncertainty, volatility measures differ along multiple dimensions, including the method of the calculation, the underlying outcome, our horizon that we're interested in calculating on, whether or not can be observed and calculated in real time. And the literature speaks about this in broad brush terms about uncertainty and risk, but we've got to carefully design the risk if we're going to be successful risk managers. And our last topic that is critical to managing the present uncertainty is to clearly define the difference between accuracy and precision in any measurement around uncertainty, either reducible uncertainty or irreducible uncertainty, and define the expected precision and accuracy of these measures before we start. And we don't define the needed accuracy and the needed precision of our measurements. We are in fact introducing more uncertainties about the uncertainties, and that results in risks on top of risks. And when you hear someone say something about the number, to ask the question, what is the accuracy of that number and what is the precision of that number? We have an 80% chance of meeting our cost deadlines, our cost targets at the scheduled deadline. Ask them, what is the precision of that 80% and what is the accuracy of that 80%? And if they say, I don't know what you're talking about, that means that number is not credible. Since everything we do in the management domain operates in the presence of uncertainties, these are critical questions to ask every 2 weeks, every month, or every day in some worlds before we take any corrective or preventive actions taken to manage in the presence of uncertainty, because we may actually be taking the wrong actions. I've mentioned in previous charts that it's uncertainties that create risk, and the root causes of those uncertainties must be determined if we're ever going to have any credible risk management process. So I'm going to introduce to you a concept that's used in our domain, which is the Apollo root cause method. It's got 4 steps. There'll be links to the materials at the back of this. And it facilitates the creation of what they would call a common reality. What are the conditions and the actions that create the root cause, that creates the uncertainty, that creates the risk? And it's really the solution that we're after, not the root cause. So let's look at that for a second. First of all, our standard root cause approach of asking why, or building charts or fishbone diagrams, are not effective. So root cause is not about telling a story. Root cause is finding the underlying uncertainties, classifying them, and building a model about how they create risk. And this method is the Apollo method. It's used at NASA here in the United States. It's used in the oil and gas business. It's used in the medical world. It's used in many places where the consequences of a risk can be life-threatening or devastating. So the traditional route to root cause is the fishbone method, or those kind of diagrams, or a failure modes and effects analysis, or the 5 whys, or some way to start asking questions and trying to tell stories. And these are simple, and I'm going to suggest simple-minded, and they usually fail to increase the probability of success. So again, I don't have any vested interest in Apollo method, but I am a trained root cause analyst using Apollo. And in the root causes analysis from Apollo, we have to have a condition and we have to have an action that's present for the effect that creates the risk. And if you remove either the condition or the action, the effect is removed. It's really that simple, and at the same time, it's that complex. So let's look at a little picture here. In actual projects, causes are never linear. They branch out into two cases. Each time we ask why an effect, and if we ask why each of these causes, we find an ever-expanding set of causes. Here's a simple example. So we observe an open fire. That is an effect that's undesirable. So what actions were taken to create that effect? Well, someone had a match and they struck the match. And for someone to strike the match, there had to be a match. It sounds that simple. It sounds kind of simple-minded, but there had to be a match that could be struck. And for the fire to start, there had to continue, there had to be some combustible material. And for this combustible material to ignite and burn, we need oxygen. Now, if we remove the action or the conditions, the fire won't start. If no one strikes the match because there are no matches to strike, or we remove the matches from the space in which the combustible material exists, we prevent the striking of the match. If we remove the combustible material, or we remove the oxygen from the area around the combustible material, even if the match is struck, no fire will start. This is the simple but highly effective approach of the Apollo method. Understanding the true problem is imperative here. It also clarifies exactly what information is needed to be gathered during the root cause analysis of investigation. It also determines what our corrective actions will be and helps ensure that the solution you select to implement is the most effective. The Apollo root cause analysis method facilitates creating this common reality in which everyone who participates agrees on the problem definition statement, including the significance reflected by the consequences or impacts from the risk created by the underlying uncertainties whose root causes we must find and remove or isolate. We have to outline when, where, what's the significance, safety, environmental, cost, revenue, frequency, all that stuff is much more detailed, and we're going to see a little bit of a picture on that. Consequently, all the challenging causes and effects relationships allow us to think more critically and understand that the problems are rarely as simple as we think they are. And the guiding principle of the Apollo root cause analysis method states that each effect has two causes in the forms of actions and conditions, and the conditions exist over time, and the actions are motions or changes in the state that relate to this incident. An Apollo method demands an exhaustive search for both the conditions, causes, and the action causes that guide the process in the form of a cause and effect diagram. This is the basis of risk management that is used in domains where we work, where rockets blow up, dams fall down, people die. Apollo root cause analysis is actually risk management. The solutions act on one or more of the causes. Okay? Any given problem has an infinite number of causes, and the Apollo root cause method is looking for the solution criteria to uncover the best solutions, ones that are within our control, that prevent a recurrence, that meet our goals, that don't cause other problems, and this can show a clear causal connections between the solution and the defined problem. And all the stakeholders can insert their own causal relationships into a chart, and we can have buy-in from everybody who's doing the root cause analysis as the basis of our risk management. So how can all these uncertainties of the project be identified and classified? Here's 4 summary areas, thanks to Mr. Bliss, who was the director of the Office of Performance Assessment and Root Cause Analysis in the United States Defense Department, who asked questions, why are we now billions of dollars over budget and what we built doesn't work? So here's where to start looking for our root causes, right? We have unrealistic technical issues, we have unrealistic cost and schedule estimates, we don't have assessments of the risk, and we have for unmitigated exposures, and we have unrealistic performances that we're doing that just simply cannot be met. So there's going to be some links in the back to the papers that support this. And as we get down to the end here, let's look at the risk management entails developing all these strategies and putting them all together and dealing with all the hazards and tracking all the processes and involving, recognizing, and making all these decisions. This is the basis of systems engineering. So risk management is actually systems engineering. It's project management, it's root cause analysis, but the architecture on top of all this are systems. And systems engineering officially is an interdisciplinary field of engineering and engineering management that focuses on how to design and integrate and manage complex systems over their life cycles, all of which contain uncertainties, both reducible and irreducible, that create risk. So as risk managers, we're actually systems engineers. There are different approaches to risk management in our engineering, systems engineering paradigm, right? There's inactive risk management. This approach, we consider the risk factors, but we don't confront the outcomes. And they're much less concerned about the potential that things may not turn out as planned. And it's easy to say that this isn't a risk management, but people prefer to do this instead of actually doing real risk management. That we make a list of the risks and we hope they don't come true, and if they do come true, we'll have a corrective action for them. Then we have reactive risk management, as we try to mitigate the effects of the risks that have materialized through some post-mortem measures. That is, our patient is now dead, our project has failed, our rocket has blown up, and now we're going to go look and see what happened. And this can include crisis management, is a reactive risk management to get our organization out of a bind. Our current COVID responses are reactive risk management. We're responding to a crisis. Then we have interactive risk management, and throughout the life cycle of the project, the systems activities, we need to look and see what the risks are, what their uncertainties are, what's the root cause of those uncertainties, and pay special attention to the requirements like configuration management, project controls, all the performance management stuff. True risk management is proactive, and if you plan and anticipate risk potentials, then implement the systems management activities for the technical direction to control the risk potentials throughout all the life cycle. the ideal world will come true with some probability of success. Asking, what are the allatory uncertainties? What are the epistemic uncertainties? How are my handling strategies going to reduce or prevent those uncertainties from turning into risks? And how am I going to get out of this? Here's our last big problem that we always encounter: the black swan. And if you're in Australia, you know that black swans are everywhere. But a black swan event is an outlier. It carries an extreme impact. In spite of all of our outlying statuses, the human nature makes us concoct some explanation for the occurrence after the fact that we didn't see it coming. The risk conditions go beyond simply calling out a low probability and high impact, but deal with low probability and catastrophic impact. And when we think about systems engineering, we have to address the black swans by looking at risk in terms of their systems and their functional components of their dependencies. So we've come to an end of our time allotment here, and I will leave up this little picture you will be able to download from these links. One of those is my blog, the Herding Cats blog, and in there are all these resources, and hopefully those will go to work for you. We're at about 46 minutes here, and we budgeted 40 to 50 minutes, and we're done with this principles course, and we'll get into the practices course next.